Welcome to everyone to the annual Mosman RSL Sub Branch ANZAC Sunday Commemorative Service, the 96th anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli. Today we shall rededicate the World War II memorial in its rebuilt form in the reinstated gardens in which you were sitting.
Almighty God, today we rededicate our memorial, now extended, to formally include the recognition of all those who gave their lives in the many conflicts in our nation's history. We ask you now to bless this memorial in their honour. May all who pass this way be reminded of their sacrifice and be inspired to pray and to work for peace and justice in our world. And we make this prayer through Jesus Christ, Prince of Peace. Amen.
Flag party, halt! Flag party, outwards, turn! Flag party, rest on, arms!
President of the RSL, Ian Henderson, Mayor Connon, Minister Skinner, Mr David McLean, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, as an old Mosman boy, it's a privilege and an honour to join you today for the rededication of what is an important memorial to Mosman's contribution to this nation's pursuit of peace. It is a pursuit which continues to this day, with some of our 3,000 of our sailors, soldiers, airmen and women putting their lives on the line on the other side of the world in places like Afghanistan and the Middle East. I was surprised to find that over 17,000 Australian men and women, for example, have fought in Iraq. It's something that we sometimes tend to forget as we go about our normal business. In our relatively short military history, Australians have fought and died in no fewer than 12 wars, with our first conflict being the dispatch of some 2,500 men to fight against the Maori uprisings in New Zealand in 1860. Thankfully, our wars with those across the ditch today are confined to the rugby field and the cricket pitch. We can only wish that that might be the case for all conflicts. Since the Maori Wars, including the Great War, which the original memorial of this site recognised, Australians have fought in the Sudan, the Boer War, the Boxer Rebellion in China. In addition to the Second World War, we have fought in Korea, Malaya, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as deploying to East Timor, Bougainville and the Solomons. Australians were also amongst the very first group of United Nations peacekeepers to Indonesia in 1947, and since then we have deployed on close to 100 United Nations missions overseas. From a relatively small population, Australians have always answered the call, and I note that one of the original inscriptions on this memorial behind me is, "They hearken the rallying cry for freedom," said in the language of the day. In a constant search for peace, over 100,000 Australians have died defending freedom, and 250,000 of us have been wounded, with many maimed for life. And many of those have come from this wonderful harbourside suburb of Mosman, adding to Mosman's proud history. From the time of the Borragagal and the Camaragal people and other tribes, to more recent history when Her Majesty's ship Sirius, the flagship of the First Fleet, was careened here in Mosman Bay, where whaling once flourished, and Mosman hosted her own first defence establishments in 1801, with a battery of cannon being established at George's Head. As Graham mentioned, I grew up in Awaba Street, not, I hasten to add, on the leafy Balmoral side. And I'm old enough to remember the submarines, gentlemen, being based at HMAS Penguin, as well as the old trams that used to run down to Sam Herford's Spit Baths, where Murray Rose used to train. Throughout our 200 years plus of recent history, Mosman citizens, people like Bill Purdy, who spoke here 2 years ago, and who flew more than 30 bombing missions over Europe, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross in the process, and many hundreds like him, have willingly answered the numerous calls to fight for their country. Sadly, too many have their names etched in gold in this memorial behind me. Over 1,200 Mosmanites fought in World War I, and some 200 of them never returned. In researching the background to the rededication of this fine memorial, I came across an article written by Kate Crawford of the Mosman Daily. It was at the time the Australian author Peter FitzSimons threw his support behind this project. And Kate interviewed Michael Crosby, another Mosman boy and a past president of the Mosman RSL, one who fought in Vietnam. And I'll quote just a couple of lines from Kate's article. She wrote, "Mr. Crosby was only 20 in 1966 when he volunteered to serve with the Australian Army in Vietnam. He was spurred on by an older man who declared, 'It would be one of the greatest experiences of your life.' Instead, what Mr. Crosby found was hell on earth, including days lying in red mud and caught in ambushes. And I was struck by the similarities of my own experience with that particular war. When I left Awaba Street for the Royal Military College, it was with a boy's own annual expectation of adventure. But the day I arrived at Nui Dat as a very young platoon commander in the 6th Battalion, I was told that my best mate had been killed in a ferocious ambush the day before. The reality of war struck home. It is a dirty, brutal, ugly business. That said, yes, there is a wonderful camaraderie. The best and most enduring friendships are forged in adversity. Graham Kells, one of the many who have worked tirelessly on this new memorial. I haven't seen Graham for years, but having served together, we can take up as if it were yesterday. But he and I are not alone amongst the great majority of those who have seen the brutality of war at close quarters, who conclude the hard way that there has to be a better way. Australian servicemen and women have rightly gained great respect amongst both our allies and our enemies in all the wars that we've fought. I can only speak from my own experience in Vietnam, where I know that Australians were perhaps most feared by the North Vietnamese and local guerrilla forces. That is a tribute particularly to the professionalism of the private soldier. It is the soldiers and the NCOs who make the Australian Army what it is today. And I know the same can be said for the Navy and the Air Force and the supporting services. Well-led Australians can achieve almost anything, and they are the equal of any sailor, soldier, airman or woman in the world. Looking back on my own 37 years experience and service in the military, I can say that I learned most from the soldiers and NCOs with whom I served. Soldiers and NCOs like those who have acquitted themselves with such distinction in countless rugged engagements from the Great War to Vietnam and are now serving with equal distinction in Afghanistan and other theatres. Today is not a day for political statements, but the occasion should nevertheless cause us to reflect on the supreme sacrifice that so many Mosman citizens and over 100,000 other Australians have made in the search for peace. A few years ago, in 2006, on the 40th anniversary of the Vietnam Battle of Long Tan, a 60 Minutes program showed two of the Long Tan veterans, Lieutenant David Sabin and Sergeant Bob Buick, revisiting the Long Tan rubber plantation. The program concluded with Sabin and Buick walking off arm in arm with their former enemies who had fought them at Long Tan, laughing and joking together. That is as it should be, but it gives a poignant underscore to the futility of war. 40 or so years ago, they sought to kill each other at the first opportunity. It would have seemed impossible back then, but today former enemies can share a barmy bar together, a popular Vietnamese beer, and reflect. But as the former enemies in Vietnam might reflect together in friendship, today we have another war on our hands, and the search for peace amongst humankind appears more elusive than ever. It seems equally impossible that we might ever, at some time in the future, sit down and share understanding with those who oppose the West today. The differences are once again, it seems, too great, too stark, although I can remember the domino theory and those who thought a unified Vietnam would usher in a communism that would sweep all before it. And back then, the differences seemed equally great, equally stark. With humankind's differences in ideology being highlighted by leaders in various countries, thousands of young men and women are once again paying with their lives in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And now, as Iran gets closer to a nuclear weapon, each side is fervently of the view that theirs is the one true path. In recent years, leaders of various persuasions have increasingly expressed their faith in God, Allah, or Yahweh, convinced that they are guided to war by a higher authority. And with God, Allah, or Yahweh on their side, they will prevail and win. Ironically, all three of the great monotheistic faiths trace their roots back to Abraham. And God, Allah, and Yahweh are one and the same, the single source of the Abrahamic tradition. Today, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is seemingly more intractable than ever. Following the decision by the United Nations in 1947 to partition Palestine, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948. And a day later, the Arab armies invaded. That conflict is now entering its 8th decade. We have failed to grasp that to defeat an urban, guerrilla or terrorist insurgency, we must deal with the cause, and negotiation, not war, should be the first resort. As long as the cause remains, the jungle, or urban guerrilla or terrorist will melt back into the shadows to strike again where humanity least expects it. And so often, it is the local population, as we've seen so tragically in recent years in Lebanon and northern Israel, for example, who suffer most in a conflict. But you do not win hearts and minds by rocketing innocent Israeli civilians in northern Israeli towns, or by destroying Palestinian schools, hospitals and roads and villages in the Gaza. As a soldier, in my view, just as we failed to defeat the insurgency in Vietnam, unless you address the underlying cause, you cannot defeat an urban insurgency or terrorist insurgency by taking it head on. You will weaken it, but you will never defeat it. And in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is the innocent Israelis, Lebanese and Palestinians, especially the women and children, who will suffer most. And in many cases, their lives will never recover. Today's wars are increasingly driven by religion, but those who are quick to engage in conflict, confident that their God is on their particular side, might also reflect that a person's religion is largely a result of birthplace and culture. By design or accident, there is more than one path, and lest we who remain Fail those who've given their lives in so many countless battles on the seas, in the air, and on the land. We must all work, not towards tolerance, but towards acceptance of different cultures and different faiths. Today, more than ever, as we remember those who fought so gallantly in the search for peace, and especially those who paid the ultimate price in the ugliness that is war, we might reflect on those 60-minute images of former enemies, walking off arm in arm together, laughing and joking, their seemingly intractable differences resolved. Like their successors today, those who fought and died that we might enjoy freedom had no say in their country's decision to wage war. They simply did their duty. But I suspect that if any of them were here today to acknowledge our heartfelt admiration and quite inadequate thanks, they might suggest that today we as a species need to move toward a greater respect for human life and human dignity. Humankind suffers a deep and permanent loss every time we go to war, and we as a species continuously fail to heed the lessons of war. In a sense, we who remain fail those who fought and died from the mud holes of the Somme to the deserts of Tobruk, to the rugged terrain of the 38th parallel in Korea, to the stinking jungles of Vietnam, and now to the icy wastes of the Hindu Kush. War should be a last, rather than, as it increasingly is today, the first resort for the resolution of our differences. The lessons of Gallipoli, Tobruk, Kapyong, Long Tan, and now Afghanistan have been hard won, and it behoves we who remain to reflect on them, for they are just a few of our most bloodiest of battles. Battles that have been fought in the finest traditions of the Australian Navy, Army, and Air Force. The raw courage and spirit of those young men and women whose names are etched on this memorial are also etched in our military history, and we will be forever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Catholic Party, precinct.
Thank you.